I'm Margaret Carroll. I'm the current chair of Planning Board for those that don't know me, and I'm just here to introduce Mike to tell us all about what's happening.
Do you want to call the meeting to order?
Oh yes, we do have a planning board quorum, so I'm calling to order the meeting of the planning board.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. So the planning board has been working with myself and RKG regarding the MBTA communities, as some of you may be familiar with. I'm sure most of you in this room are very familiar with it already. And thanks to the people who are joining us on Teams as well. We're probably not going to be able to accommodate if there are questions or comments through the Teams meeting, but obviously, you're tuned in. If you can't hear, just send a note in the chat, and I'll try to make some adjustments on our end here. So back to MBTA communities, there's a law that was passed by the state that requires towns that are designated as MBTA communities, up to being an MBTA community, even though there's no train stop in town. We are adjacent to Grafton, which has a stop, and Westboro, as you know, has a stop. So the state law captures Upton as a small town adjacent community. And we'll go through those requirements through the presentation to RKG shortly. Just a couple notes. We're fortunate enough to be designated as a housing choice community. We were able to obtain that designation last year. And the only important thing to note about that is that it opens the town up for possible funding. And that funding we were able to get get RKG's help with all this, the very specifics of this law. So RKG was able to put together an economic feasibility analysis, which looked into the feasibility of doing an inclusionary zoning portion inclusionary zoning requirement within the MBTA zoning district. For those of you who are not familiar, inclusionary zoning is just a different way of saying providing an affordable housing requirement within this district, should the town decide to approve it or even approve that inclusionary zoning measure. But as some of you are probably already familiar, the town passed inclusionary zoning town-wide at your last town meeting. So I can talk to people if they have any additional questions about that afterwards or later. And I'll just say, I'll leave it at this, then I'll hand it over to Eric. The planning board had discussed a couple districts, and we vetted out one or two, and there's one particular area for a district that the planning board is supportive of currently. And so we can talk about that tonight, but I just want to mention that, thank you all for coming here. We'll have a conversation. There'll be breakout session. If there are new ideas that generate from this meeting, new locations, things that were not considered before, we can absolutely, or the planning board, I don't need to speak on behalf of the planning board can absolutely change course, and it's not going to be a huge heavy lift for them to do that. So we're open to all ideas and suggestions out of tonight. So again, thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand it over to Eric from RKG.
Hi everyone. Is that better? My name is Eric Alverson. I'm a principal with RKG Associates. RKG is a planning, economic development, and real estate consulting firm. I work out of our Boston office, but we work all over the country, but the Boston office mostly covers our projects across New England. So Michael had hired us to help not only with the economic feasibility analysis, and we can talk more about what inclusionary zoning is and why what we call an EFA was necessary to do in the case of Upton, but also to help out with sort of providing an MBTA Communities 101 kind of overview presentation, because I know sure members of the planning board are intimately familiar with the law and the guidelines, but members of the public or maybe other boards and committees in town aren't as much. So I always find it helpful when we come to a community and start talking about MBTA communities, district locations, what are the requirements. It's good to kind of start with a 101 presentation because the law is straightforward, but it left a ton up to interpretation, which was then interpreted by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, or as you may hear me say, HLC, as people commonly refer to it. They wrote a big set of guidelines that we then have to use as towns and cities and consultants to try to figure out, okay, how do we apply this law that's meant for 177 towns to your specific community, should you choose to move this forward. So I always find it helpful to start with the 101, so we're all kind of starting with the same factual information about the law and how the guidelines are meant to be applied to Upton specifically. Even though the guidelines are written and we have to follow them, there's a lot of misconceptions. I'll show you the list of towns we worked in. It's significant at this point. But there's always a misperception that like the law is very stringent and there's no flexibility and the state is telling us exactly how we have to do it. While there are certain things that we will have to meet as Upton and as other small adjacent towns, there's actually a lot of flexibility in the law with like how you can actually meet that. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight too. And I'll kind of keep walking back and forth because I forgot my slide changer. Okay, there we go. So what I'd like to cover with you all tonight is just a quick introduction, talk a little bit about our experience just so you know where we're coming from. We'll give you the overview of the MBTA Communities Act, so talk about all those different requirements and how they're applied. We'll then talk a little bit about the process for tonight and the engagement opportunity and what we'd like you to do at your table discussions, and then we can wrap up with next steps. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm Eric Halverson, I'm the lead consultant working with Mike and the town on this project. I've been working so far in all these communities. I may have left some off, but you can see they run the gambit of larger cities to small towns, all across the 177 communities that fall within the MBTA Communities District. I also built the MBTA compliance model for the state, so I have a pretty intimate knowledge of how the compliance model works and how it can be applied. And then I also helped design the guidelines for the economic feasibility analysis, which we've run already for Mike in the town. Okay, so for those of you in the room or at home that might not be familiar with the MBTA Communities Act, or as it's commonly referred to, Section A, Section 3A rather. So the law that was passed by the legislature established a requirement that there's 177 designated quote-unquote MBTA communities. Those communities generally fall within either the MBTA service area, and over time that service area has actually expanded as the MBTA has expanded. Or in the case of a community like Upton, you happen to be next to a town with a fixed rail stop. In this case, actually 2 towns that have a fixed rail stop. So that's why you're considered an adjacent community and not a rapid transit or a commuter rail community where those communities actually have rail service within their borders. The law basically kind of set 4 high-level requirements as set by the legislature for then HLC to interpret through the guidelines. The first was each community in the 177 has to have at least 1 zoning district of what they call a reasonable size. We'll talk about what that means. Within that district, the zoning for residential development cannot have any age restrictions, so you can't set a 55 and older or a 65 and older restriction in your zoning and only target housing for older adults. And then you also have to have zoning that allows multifamily housing that's suitable for families with children. And all that means is, in some communities, or at least years ago, they would say, if you're going to build multifamily housing, you can only build studios and 1 bedrooms. Or you can only build studios, 1s and 2s, no 3 bedrooms. That does exclude a certain segment of the population which ends up violating federal fair housing laws. So this is now saying you just have to allow a range of bedrooms. And you can't say that you can't have a certain bedroom. So that's all that's saying. Within your MBTA district, your designated zoning district, you have to have a minimum gross density of 15 dwelling units an acre. And we'll talk about what that is and what that looks like. And then the 4th piece, which is not applicable to you, would only be applicable to communities that have direct fixed rail service. They have to have a certain amount of units and land around a half mile around their station, but you don't have to worry about that. It's really the first three that we are concerned about here. And really, the reason why the legislature put the law in place is Massachusetts, our housing is becoming more and more scarce, particularly as we have more people move to the state, and everything's getting more expensive, because for decades before right now, we didn't really build enough housing to sort of keep pace. We also have a lot of smaller households as we have an aging population. That just requires more housing itself. So that was the whole sort of impetus behind that, is to say, we haven't made a lot of housing progress, so let's try to make some now. This is just a map really quickly of all the communities that fall within the 177 cities and towns that are required to follow this law and pass the zoning. And then this is the same map. It's just colored by the different designations for communities. So you'll see there are rapid transit communities. Those are the ones in the darkest blue that are north and south of Boston. There are the commuter rail communities, which are sort of dotted in that greenish color around the map. Those are communities that have fixed commuter rail service. And then you have the adjacent communities, which are communities that are a little bit bigger, I think over 8,000 people, that are also adjacent to a commuter rail or a rapid transit community. And you can see their deadline for compliance is December 31st of 2024, so it's coming up pretty quickly. It's going to be a busy fall for a lot of town meetings around this part of the state. And then we have Upton's classification, which is the adjacent small town. So your deadline for getting this voted out at town meeting is December 31st, 2025. So voting it out, and then you just have to send your compliance package to the state by that deadline. As I mentioned before, I find it helpful to start with kind of a baseline of facts. So one thing I do like to talk about is what the MBTA communities is not. We just talked a little bit about what it is, right? It's a law that's trying to create more housing in these communities in the Commonwealth. But there are a couple of misconceptions about what people might think it is, but it's really not. The first one is one that I get in every community and from start to finish in a process, which is once we establish this district and we come up with our unit capacity, which I'll talk about, do we have to build the housing, either as the town or does the private sector have to build that housing? And the answer is no. This is just about zoning and laying the zoning framework and the zoning regulations for that district. The state doesn't care whether or not someone comes in and builds. I'm sure they would love to see people build these districts, but they're not going to hold you accountable if nobody does build. So that's an important one. It's also not a housing production target, so where they have established unit thresholds for each community, but it's not a mandate to build, and it also doesn't mean that your target, we'll get to this, but your target unit count is 150. If you were to say, wow, we have districts and we want to get up to 500, or we want to get up to 400, or whatever the number is, this isn't just a housing production target. You can kind of go above that as much as you want, or you can hit the 150. As Mike was mentioning, it's not restricted to address only affordable housing needs. It's supposed to really just get housing to the market. One way to get affordable housing through the MBTA Communities Act is to have town-wide inclusionary zoning, which you had passed at town meeting. So that's a great step. So if someone were to come and say, okay, I'm ready to build, just because it makes the numbers easy, 100 units, and your inclusionary zoning, because it makes the numbers easy, is 10% of that to be set aside as affordable housing, you get 90 market rate units and 10 affordable units, and that you can do here. Yes, ma'am.
Just a point of clarification, because I know this has come up. You say it's not restricted to only addressing affordable housing needs, but in fact, doesn't it restrict how many affordable housing units can go in an MBTA community district?
That's a great question. So if we talk about inclusionary zoning, yes. The law says that a community cannot have more than 10% of the units set aside through inclusionary zoning, and you also cannot have those units go below 80% of the area median income in terms of where the rent or the sale threshold is set. But by doing the economic feasibility analysis, you're allowed to go up higher, upwards of 20%, and you can go below the 80% if it's found to be financially viable, which is the exercise that we went through.
But it can't go above 20%.
Yeah. And then there are other options. So let's say, for example, you have the by right multifamily district that complies with MBTA communities, but a nonprofit developer comes and says, oh, we'd love to build a low-income housing tax credit project, and we're going to target households at 50% of AMI, and we're going to make it 100% affordable. That would be totally fine, because they're not going through they're using their own funds, and they're using low-income housing tax credits to get to that project. So there wouldn't be anything per se to restrict somebody from doing that. But just in terms of the laws that the town can apply to the district, you're right, it technically is 10% and 80% of AMI. Yeah.
It says it's not a housing production target, but you said our target is 150, so that kind of contradicts what you said, so I'm confused.
Yeah, I guess what I meant is it doesn't have to be treated as your ultimate ceiling, the 150. So you could go above it and create more.
So we do have a target, but we're not limited.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry if that wasn't clear. Yes. And I just want to mention too, this isn't really intended to be kind of that one size fits all, cure all of our housing needs in one law kind of program. As I mentioned, it mostly addresses market rate with the ability to have some set aside for affordable housing. There are a lot of other housing tools out there that communities either have access to or could have access to address other needs. And the last thing I want to say is currently, as of today, this is not viewed as optional by the Commonwealth or the Attorney General. She's come out with her own statements on this. We'll see how things play out the rest of the year, but at least as of today, this is not viewed as an optional compliance. And then just quickly, as I mentioned, there's a ton of housing tools out there that communities can take advantage of to address sort of what we call the continuum of housing, all the way from those who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability to those who fall into like the extremely low income, your 30 or 50% of area median income. This MBTA communities is really intended to address the kind of moderate income workforce through the inclusionary housing provision, and then really just getting more housing in general on the market rate side. It's really just trying to produce more housing overall. So just to show you sort of where this fits in the continuum. And then, as I mentioned, there is a often confusing piece about the law where we're really talking about setting the zoning and the regulations that are going to be applied to the land within the district itself. So zoning is not necessarily housing production, because just by setting the zoning for a place doesn't mean that someone's going to come in, whether it be the existing property owner or someone they might sell to, say a developer. There's so many other considerations that those folks take into account other than just what the zoning is. So just because a community sets the zoning, it may take 5, 10, 20 years or never. You may never see development in your district because there are a lot of other things like what is the strength of the market? How developable is the site? Are there utilities to the site? Is there a lot of wetlands on the site? Is there a lot of ledge and steep slope on the site? Not that I'm saying your community is not desirable, but how desirable is the community versus other communities that are around you? Is there available labor to actually build all the housing that we're talking about and that we hope to get built? Is the property owner willing to sell their land to actually spark new development? So there's a ton of other factors that are sort of outside the zoning, and quite frankly, many of these that are just outside of the community's control that kind of dictate whether development will take place. Yeah.
Is there anything to prevent a town that doesn't like this, and not us, from, for example, creating a zone that's entirely wetland and unbuildable?
Definitely. Yeah. So when we get to the maps, we'll see that. Yeah. The state has designated areas all around the 177 communities as what they call excluded land, and wetlands are part of that excluded layer.
Can you follow up on what David just asked? If the MBTA community is in an already densely, can it be in an already densely developed area?
Yes, yeah, it could be a redevelopment scenario, or if you have a piece of vacant open land, it could be that too. Yeah. And just quickly, there are implications. If you've been following this, you've probably seen this, but for those communities that either don't comply or choose to not comply, outside of the potential legal ramifications that you may be familiar with, a city or town would lose access to all of these different grant programs that are up here. And I noticed in the information packet as I was perusing, it looks like the town of Upton's gotten about $3 million worth of state grants. So if those programs are on this list, I'm sure many of them are, then that would prevent you from being eligible for all kinds of grants, not just housing related ones, but also infrastructure grants, transportation grants, climate resilience, hazard mitigation, vulnerability grants. There's a lot on this list. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about Upton's specific compliance requirements. So within MBTA communities, there's kind of 3 buckets of stuff that we have to look at to try to figure out whether the district itself and the regulations that are in place for that district are going to comply with the law and with your requirements. So I kind of call them the 3 tests. So the first test is the land area itself. So the land area deals with the districts that we draw, whether it's 1 district or 10 districts, irregardless. It's talking about the land itself and the land that's within the districts that we draw. The second test is the unit capacity test. So once we figure out where we want the districts to be, we have to figure out how we're going to leverage those districts to, at a minimum, meet the 150 unit capacity, or higher if you choose to go higher. Tucked inside the capacity is also the density measure. So we have to make sure that across 1 or more districts, they average out to 15 dwelling units an acre. And the last test is the zoning, which is the written language that will be applied, the written regulations that will be applied to the MBTA district. The interesting thing in the flexibility within the law is that if you choose to have more than 1 district, you can actually apply different zoning to those districts. The zoning doesn't have to be consistent across districts. So if you have 1 district where you say, oh, it'd be nice to have a 3-story multifamily apartment building here, and another district where it's, I really like attached townhouses, you could do those. Or you could have a district maybe in the downtown that has a sort of development character that fits your downtown versus one that might be on the outskirts of town. So there's a lot of flexibility in the law with not only where you place the districts, but also how you set the zoning. So we'll talk about each of the 3 tests just so that we all understand them. So within the land area, we'll talk about the location of the district, the size of the district. We don't have to worry about transit adjacency here, and we'll talk about excluded land. Under capacity, we'll talk about the unit count and the density. And then under zoning, I'll just give a really high-level overview of some of the key pieces of zoning that go into the MBTA compliance model and sort of how all that works together to generate the unit capacity and the density. The key thing about these tests, as you'll see as you go through this process together, I think of each of them as like a cog that's sort of trying to move this thing along. Because if you turn one of those cogs or one of those dials, it ends up moving all of the other ones. So you kind of have to think of all 3 of them together. So if you think about this, if we were to draw a district of, let's say, 20 acres, and we apply a certain zoning to that 20 acres, we're going to generate our unit capacity and our density from that. But if we then decide down the road to go from 20 acres to 50 acres, or 20 acres down to 10 acres, changing the size of that district, but applying the same zoning, we're going to get a different unit capacity. So we always have to just be thinking about how each of these things affects each other as we're making decisions. Okay, so for the land area requirements, Upton being a small adjacent community is a lot more unique than the commuter rail communities and even the adjacent communities in that you don't have a minimum land area. Most of the other communities have a minimum land area size of their district of 50 acres. But since you're a much smaller community with arguably lower capacity and further out from the T, you don't have a minimum land area, which means your district size is going to be governed by the regulations that are on the bottom of that table, which is called minimum district size. So in the guidelines, HLC has said that the minimum district size of any district, and this applies to any community, has to be at least 5 acres. So when they say a district of reasonable size, that's, in your case, the district of reasonable size is 5 acres. The only other thing that we have to take a look at is that third line that says minimum contiguous district size. So what that means is, let's say you have 2 districts, and those districts total up to 50 acres. And they're separate districts, one on one side of the town, one's on the other, but they total to 50 acres. That says 50% of that 50 acres has to be located within at least within one district. So one of your districts has to be at least a touch over 25 acres. So we always have to look at that, because in some communities we worked in, they might have 5 or 6 districts, but they're all relatively small. And then we add them up and they might add up to 50 acres, but each of them is only, I don't know, say 10 acres in size, but we need one that's 25 acres in size. So we also, that's why I say there's a lot of like these cogs in the wheel that we have to constantly watch and make sure. That's one of those ones that sometimes gets us in the end if we're not paying attention to how big those districts are and how much total land area you have. But at a bare minimum, the minimum district size that we're looking at is 5 acres.
But in Upton, that would be, 7.5 acres would be the 50%?
2.5.
2.5.
Yeah, but you couldn't. But the tricky thing is, you couldn't have 2.5 acre districts because they have to be over 5 acres.
So 5 is really our.
Yeah, 5 is really the minimum. Yeah. You know, the other thing is, if you had a 5 acre district and you have to get to 150 units, that's a density of 30 units an acre. So you sort of think about that too. Maybe 30 units an acre to folks is totally acceptable. Maybe it's not. The other thing we have to look at is not just where the districts are located and how big they are, but how they're drawn. So this is really a mapping exercise. The state wants to see districts where all the parcels are drawn together and they're all within, just sort of nicely packaged in the same district. So the mapping example up on the top left, where the parcels are colored in blue, that would be an example of what they would consider to be a contiguous district, where all the parcels are directly either across the lot line from each other, or you can jump a right-of-way, so those parcels on the bottom are kind of going across the road. So that's totally fine. As long as the parcels are across from each other, you could draw a district like that. This example in the brown in the bottom right is an example of what they would consider to be a non-contiguous district, where you have 2 areas where you do have contiguous parcels, but this person was trying to be very tricky and then use the right-of-way as the connector. So they're trying to use this street in the middle as the connector. These are not across from each other, so the state would look at that and say, I think you're trying to play some kind of game here, so they wouldn't allow that. So we just have to make sure that the districts are drawn in a contiguous fashion so that when HLC reviews it, they would approve it. A couple of other considerations if you're interested. The example on the top left, where you have the kind of blue parcels in the middle and green on the outside, highlights a concept that some communities that we're working with have used, which is called sub-districts. So as I was saying, there is some flexibility when it comes to how you draw your districts and also the zoning that you would apply to the district. So in this case, the parcels in the middle of that district in blue, those might have one type of zoning. Maybe those are limited to 2 stories in height. And then the parcels in green that are along the rights of way, along the streets, maybe those are limited to 3 stories in height because they're on a public right of way and they have more visibility. That's totally fine. You can make sub-districts within a district if you wanted to do that. They just have to follow parcel lines. The other thing you can't do would be this example on the bottom right, which is we have a district that spans this whole area, but in the middle, let's say we have a park. You can't draw the district to purposefully exclude the park. In this case, they would say, oh, you're trying to exclude the park so that you can get your density up because you can't develop on a park. So if you can't develop on a park, you're adding land area to your district, but you're not adding units to your district. Therefore, your density is going to either go up or down depending if you include that park. So if we had an instance like this in Upton, we'd have to take the whole thing, even though you wouldn't be able to you wouldn't be able to build on the park, of course, but we'd have to take it from a district perspective, and we'd have to count that land area as part of the district, so, yeah.
How does that work with wetlands? Because wetlands are kind of excluded, you said?
Yep.
So is that the same thing? You can't have wetlands in the middle of a district?
So you could have wetlands in the middle of the district, but what ends up happening is, just like conservation land, wetlands, open water bodies, like a pond, town-owned land. So let's pretend that was like town hall sitting in the middle of there. Any of those kind of excluded land, the state won't let you count that for buildable area. So it would be the same thing as this. We have to put it in the district, but we could never say, oh, we're gonna generate units from that piece of land because it's excluded.
5-acre parcel, does it have to be the buildable land, or would it include the town hall in the middle of it? If, let's look at your bottom square, or your bottom, whatever that is.
Yep.
Let's say that's 5 acres. With the public land smack dab in the middle, would that still count as 5 acres, even though you can't develop the middle of it?
Yes, it would, because it's based on gross acres, not net acres,
But
yes.
you need higher density around it in order
Yeah.
to house
Yeah.
it all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So as we're thinking about districts, even though tonight we're not necessarily thinking about size, we're thinking about location, as we take your feedback and start to think of areas that you're pointing out after this meeting, we'll want to think about the 50% of total land area. We'll want to think about how do we draw them in a contiguous manner and make sure they're at least 5 acres or more. And then did we draw the districts in a manner that's going to be compliant with the law? So those are the kinds of questions that we'll want to pay attention to as we're going forward. Okay, so test number 2 is the unit capacity test. So essentially, once we have drawn our districts, we need to figure out how many units does the MBTA compliance model say could fit, quote unquote, fit within this district. Or what's essentially another way to say it is, on all the parcels that are within our district, what's the build out? Essentially runs a build out model on a parcel by parcel basis to generate the unit counts. So in Upton, we have a minimum unit capacity of 150 units. That's the minimum amount for an adjacent small town. As I mentioned, you could exceed that, but you can't go below the 150 units. And we have to have a minimum density of 15 dwelling units an acre. Another way to think about that is if somebody owned a perfectly square 1 acre piece of land, they would have, in order to comply with this, you'd have to build 15 units on 1 acre of land. So those are the 2 unit capacity measures that we have to pay attention to here. The really interesting thing about the law is it provides a definition of multifamily housing, since this is about multifamily housing. And I would like to show this graphic because I think it does a nice job of kind of showing the continuum of different types of housing that would technically count under the law as multifamily. The definition says multifamily housing is a structure with 3 or more units in it. So it could be something like a triple decker under the law counts as multifamily housing. They also have a provision in the law where you could also count 2 unit buildings on a parcel. So let's say you have 1 parcel of land and you build 2 duplex units next to each other, that could also count. Those are both kind of the floor of what counts as multifamily. And then of course it goes up to as high of a number as you can imagine. But the floor is either 3 units or 2 duplexes on a lot. So that gives, I think, communities a ton of flexibility to think about the building types and the built form that they would like to see in these different districts. As I mentioned, one district could allow 6-story buildings, one district could allow 2-story buildings. And you can have sort of anything in between. So just as an example of how this calculation could play out hypothetically with this example, so let's pretend for a second that we take that blue district that we had looked at earlier, and let's pretend that that's a 10-acre district. And we establish zoning for that district, and that zoning says, okay, under this zoning in this 10-acre district, it could generate 150 units. So because I made the math nice and easy, you take 150 units, you divide it by 10 acres, that's 15 dwelling units an acre. So that's kind of how the math would work at its most simplistic. And we ask ourselves, okay, are we compliant with this district? Yeah, we have a district that's over 5 acres, we've got 10 acres, our zoning allows 150 units, and we have 15 dwelling units an acre, so we're good to go. But density is defined a little bit differently under 3A, in that what would happen if that 10-acre district all of a sudden had 2 acres of park space that we have to now include because we can't purposefully exclude that park space. Technically, we have a 10-acre district, to your point earlier, we have a 10-acre district, but we can only develop or count units on 8 of those 10 acres. So what happens now is we had this scenario before, which was nice and easy, nice and clean, but now we have this where we can only develop on 8 acres, and if we apply the same zoning to that 8 acres, we end up short 100, we need 120 units here over our 8 acres to get to the same density. So we just have to make sure that as we're thinking about excluded land, in the case of the example on the bottom left, we may need to increase the density a little bit, we may need to think about how we're drawing our districts a little bit, just to make sure that we're always coming out above the 150 units and at or above the 15 dwelling units an acre. So as I mentioned before, there's so many ways in which you could draw districts. You could have a huge district, you could have sort of a little bit of unit capacity, a really restrictive set of zoning, and that's going to result in very low density. So the bigger our districts are and the more restrictive our zoning is, the harder it's going to be to get to our unit capacity and our density numbers. But on the other hand, we could have kind of a mid-sized district. We could hit really high unit capacity, we could have fairly permissive zoning, and that's going to drive our density numbers a lot higher. Or we could have a scenario where we have a really big district in terms of acres, but if we have a really big district, we need very permissive zoning to drive higher unit count, because with the bigger district, it's going to be harder to hit your density number. So again, all these things are kind of playing together and playing against each other. So as we think about unit capacity, we're just asking ourselves, do we have the 150 units or more, and are we going to hit the 15 dwelling units across our districts? And one thing I want to mention, if you have more than one district, it's an average of the densities. So that's kind of another way that it's flexible. So if you have one district that's 30 dwelling units an acre, and then you have another one that's, what would that be, like 8 dwelling units an acre, and you just average those, and you've got to get above 15. So it's not that all of them have to be 15 or above. One could be really high and one could be really low. So long as they average together and you hit the 15, that would comply. Okay, so just really quickly on zoning, as I mentioned before, the zoning sort of can and can't do certain things. This is my can do slide. So as we mentioned before, the zoning can't mandate age-restricted housing, so you can't have any age restrictions. You can't regulate the size of the units, so in some zoning, they might have said, well, your 1 bedrooms can't be bigger than 700 square feet. Your 2 bedrooms can't be bigger than 900 square feet. You can't do that. You let the market dictate how big they're going to be or how small they're going to be. You can't regulate the bedroom size or the bedroom mix, which we talked about before. You can't regulate the size of the actual bedrooms in square feet, which some zoning used to have. You can't limit or regulate the number of occupants in a unit. Now this is still regulated by like the Board of Health or by code, but it's not regulated by zoning in this case. So there are still other provisions, like you still have to follow the Conservation Commission's regulations. You still have to follow all state environmental regulations. You have to follow health code. You have to follow building code. You have to follow the inspector's regulations. So it's not like this law is trying to skirt all town control on other things, but just in terms of the zoning itself, these are the things that the zoning is not going to be allowed to do. A big one is zoning can't mandate mixed-use development in an MBTA district. There are ways around that if that's something of interest, and we could talk about that if you want. But in the zoning itself, this is zoning for multifamily housing. you can't mandate that someone, in order to build housing, has to build first floor commercial, because you're sort of putting an unnecessary barrier in place to multifamily. Then we talked about this one before around affordability, not being able to exceed 10% of the total units at 80% of the area median income without an economic feasibility analysis. In the MBTA compliance model that kind of runs a build out for your unit capacity, the zoning parameters on the right are kind of really the big ones that the model takes into account as it's generating unit capacity. Now, of course, I fully recognize that most zoning bylaws have way more in it than just what I'm showing you. So I understand there's a big difference between what's asked for in the model and what's typically in a town zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw will have a lot more detail than the model does, but those are kind of the big things. What's the minimum size a parcel has to be developable? That's one question it asks. How tall can the building be? Is there a floor to area ratio or some kind of lot or building coverage that dictates how big the footprint of the building can be, as well as the volume of the building? Is there an open space requirement? What are the setbacks like? How many parking spaces per unit do you require? As you can imagine, if you're thinking about surface parking, for example, if you require one surface parking space per unit versus 2 parking spaces, it's a lot more land. That's double the land that's needed for parking if you're going from 1 to 2. We have to the model has to take that into account, because that reduces the building footprint, right? The more parking you require and the more open space you require, the less land you have to build on. So that takes all that into account. A lot of communities have been putting in dwelling unit per acre maximums. We know we have to hit the 15, so some communities are thinking, can we sort of set that a little bit higher? Maybe a lot of communities are going 18, 20, just to make sure that we get to the 15 when they run the model. Some communities do lot area per dwelling unit, so let's say you have a 10,000 square foot parcel and you require 1,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. You take 10,000 square feet for the parcel, divided by 1,000, you'd be able to build 10 units, for example. So that's how that one would work. And then the unit cap in the district, it's some very specific cases, the state will allow a community to put a unit cap in place for a district. Where I've seen it happen is where the community owns the land, they put out an RFP for the land, and they go through a developer solicitation. The developer says, we're going to come forward and build 300 units on this parcel. The units the capacity is kind of set for that district by the development agreement, so that's why we have to have that in the model, just in case there's that specific requirement in the district. But these are kind of the big ones to think about, mostly the ones that are toward the top. And then this is just a recap slide, so we know we've got the 5 acre minimum, 150 unit minimum capacity, and the 15 dwelling unit minimum there. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I know I probably threw an incredible amount of information out there, but hopefully it helps answer some questions, probably creates some others. So I'll stop, if that's okay, Mike, and I can just ask if there's any clarifying questions. Okay, yeah.
This is all well and good, you so many units here, so many units there. Nobody's mentioned anything about utilities. We are extremely limited in this town as to where the water and sewer runs. How does that come into this picture?
Yeah, great question.
Because now if a developer's coming in, we say, you're going to run the sewer up there, you realize that, right? And the water? Because the town is going to do it.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, great question. We've worked in a lot of communities where there's either no sewer at all or it's limited service area around the community. So I'd answer that, in 2 ways. The first is sort of the legal answer from the law's perspective, which is the law is agnostic on water, sewer, electric, transportation, any kind of infrastructure related to the development itself, because it's all about zoning in this case and not an actual development proposal. So what they've said is just zone where you think it's appropriate to zone. The other way I would answer that, which would be kind of more Upton specific, would be through this exercise that we're hoping to engage you in. We're hoping that you all will sort of take that into account if you think it's important to identify a district location that is already served by infrastructure, maybe that's a good place to start and put your districts. But there's nothing limiting you from placing it in an area that's not currently served. And if a developer wants to do it, the state's like, they'll figure it out. That's kind of the answer.
So just to confirm and to follow up on what Paul just said, and I'm not saying this is where I come from, if Upton did not want to put any more housing in, we could look at a zone on the top of Peppercorn Hill or something, I mean, far away from any utilities, correct? That would be cost prohibitive for a developer, and a state would not, as long as it's buildable, the state would not say that it's not compliant.
Yeah, as long as it's not excluded land and it's buildable land, just not served by infrastructure. The state's other response to this question has been, there are other, for at least on the sewer side, there are other options. If the development is big enough, they could think about like a package treatment plant or treatment on site. So that's kind of another way where they've said to communities, it's not always about extending a sewer line, particularly in communities that don't have sewer already. Somebody would have to come up with a creative solution and an expensive solution to do that.
I'm sorry.
But that's just driving up the cost to some developer, which is gonna make this less attractive to do this.
Depending on where you put it, yeah, it definitely would up the cost, that's for sure.
Do you have funds for the developers then to offset these costs?
I don't know what the state has in mind for the future, but there are state grant programs. One that is a good one that I know a lot of communities will use for infrastructure is called MassWorks. It is a competitive state grant program that's open to all 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. And the idea behind MassWorks is to have the state provide a grant to either the city or town, or even possibly the developer in some cases, if they're partnering with the city or town, to build out infrastructure. It's gone to pay for things like water and sewer improvements and different types of transportation improvements as well.
It is the developer's responsibility to provide the infrastructure, though, is what you're saying. The town doesn't have to pay for it. The developer has to find a way, if they want to use that land.
And I was wondering if they had funds to do that or how that would
Yep.
work.
Yeah, so that's one example of a potential funding pot. Yep.
So the town, that's what the sewer system
Right,
grant makes
that's what we're doing
MassWorks
right now.
grant, right?
Yeah, so the town received $3.6 million from the MassWorks, Housing Works, now Housing Works program, to extend sewer and water just down this road to connect to the proposed Governor's Landing site.
But it doesn't have to be sewer and water. Our development has 58 units with communals both. We have a well and sewer. Now, I don't know how that costs compared with the hookup and extension and having to do all that, but it is a balance that the developer could bring.
Yeah, definitely, agreed.
Does the housing bond bill include anything for MBTA communities, or is that mostly, or is that still coming out in the wash? Does nobody know what's included in it?
Yeah, it is officially out. It was
Yeah.
approved, I think,
Yeah.
last week.
Yeah,
It's still sitting in my on my desktop, so I'm still working my way through it. So I don't know.
so I have to read it.
If I come back, I'll have a good answer for you. Any others? Okay.
Well, what constitutes compliance? What does that mean? Can you explain that?
Sure. So at the end of the MBTA communities process for any city or town, what they need to do is sort of package up all the work that's been done and then submit that to the state, and they do the compliance review.
The town does?
The town packages up everything that we're doing, all the work that Michael and the planning board have done already. So it constitutes sending the state the district locations.
Oh, I see, okay.
You would send that in a map file, essentially. You send the state the results of the MBTA compliance model, which is all your unit and your density calculations, and then you send the state your zoning. So those are the three big primary things that they're looking at.
Is that done before or after town meeting vote?
I would after, yeah, because they need to know.
That's when we need to start.
And the zoning has to have passed town meeting before you can submit it, and that passing town meeting has to pass the Attorney General as well. So
Correct.
those steps too, yeah.
Yeah, the Attorney General has folks in their office that are working with HLC and they're doing reviews essentially jointly. So the Attorney General is looking at all the zoning, HLC also looks at the zoning, but then HLC looks at all the district size and all that compliance. The other thing to consider too, which some of our communities have done, is HLC has set up what they call a pre-compliance review. You can submit your material prior to starting your public hearing process, and certainly prior to starting town meeting. And they have a 90-day window in which to review, and then they'll meet with the town and they'll say either, everything looks great, go ahead and start going through your local approval process, or they'll say, oh, you know what, we flagged these couple things that you should really change before you go through your process. So depending on the timing and how long it takes for each community, but it is something I would recommend if there is time to do it, because you get a lot of good feedback and they'll definitely tell you.
Let's actually answer the second part of my question. The possibility that we work it through a town meeting, do some miracle, and then the Attorney General says, no, you've made a technical mistake in the law. We'd like them to look at that first. Yeah.
Yep. There is also, I will leave too, if they find, let's say you run out of time and you just go through the town meeting process, everything gets approved locally, you submit it. I think you're sort of technically in this window of like compliance, even if there's some tweaks that need to be made. I think there's some level of forgiveness there because you did actually make an effort to submit it, you just did something wrong or whatever happened. So. Okay, so one thing that we wanted to do, well, the primary thing that we wanted to do tonight was to talk a little bit about districts. So there was a housing production plan done, which is different than what we're talking about tonight, in 2023. And as part of the housing production plan, which looks at housing across the whole spectrum, it's not just MBTA community related, there were a couple of general areas where during that time, members of the public who engaged in the process had identified potential for different types of housing. The majority of, and they're all circled in red here on this map that comes right from the housing production plan. They're mostly areas along Route 140, kind of on either side of Upton's town center. And then there's one all the way on the far north of town along North Street as you approach the south side of I-90. So if you're thinking about places to start as we get into the mapping exercise, this might be something to consider just as a do I agree with this or do I not, as we're talking amongst ourselves. It might give you some ideas as to what was said a year or so ago as part of the housing production plan. And then Mike's just going to share some of the work I think he's been doing here with the planning board on 2 other districts.
Thanks, Eric. And again, I don't think I've introduced myself. Mike Antonellis, Director of Land Use and Inspectional Services. So what you're looking at here is, this is the roughly, it might not be the exact bounds of it, but roughly the Upton Center Business District. So that was evaluated initially as being a potential location for the district. The reason would be because it's an existing village area in the way that it is used, designed historically, what have you. Ultimately, we put this through the compliance model. It spit out numbers. We could probably work with this and get it approved through the state if this was of interest. This is a good option if the intent were to utilize this as an opportunity to create infill housing within that village center district as a way to, when you're bringing in market rate apartment units, you're bringing in expendable income. That expendable income, where would it be spent? Locally. So it would be a potential to create a bit of a injection into that village area. If you want to go to the next one. We also, the planning board also evaluated this district, and this showed up. Both these districts were circled in red in the map of the town that was on here before through the housing production plan. And so this site currently, I don't have a copy of the zoning map, but folks might be familiar with this. That is the Governor's Landing site. It is the proposed senior housing, 55 plus, combined with a general market rate condo style units. And so that development is and was approved for 127 total units on, I believe it's 80 acres worth. And the 80 acres is these two large parcels behind this orange rectangle and the orange rectangle, because it includes those properties. The orange rectangle that's cross-hatched in there, that is the town's general business district. The general business district comes about 300 feet off of Route 140. So the site selected here that was tested is approximately 14 acres of that strip of the general business district. After considering both of these districts, the planning board decided that they really, pending the conversation that happens tonight, and any other ideas that would be cause for change in course, like I was mentioning earlier, which is absolutely an option. This is the district that the planning board would like to get behind going forward for compliance. The reasons: it is obviously located on Route 140, which is a state highway, so heavily traveled area. It's in close proximity to Upton Center, which is the district that was just up there that I discussed previously. It's located mostly on a site which has gone through a rigorous review process for senior housing and market rate housing. Would be located in the existing general business zone. And as Eric was mentioning previously, we would have the option to allow for retail use in this district as an option, just not necessarily a requirement. So it would be keeping in with the original intent of the general business zone to have business. So there's that, provides that option as well. It's on vacant land, so it likely wouldn't have an impact to existing aesthetics, right? If we were to utilize the Upton Center business district for this district, there would be a lot of consideration about the existing aesthetic, the historical nature of the area. You sort of bypass that issue because it's on vacant land, essentially, along Route 140. Not that you wouldn't care what it looks like, I just mean about blending in to an existing pattern. It is, and as I discussed previously, this is at the end of where the sewer and water extension would go. So this is the site that is being extended to provide for that infrastructure. It also avoids a lot of the pitfalls that Erica discussed in one of the previous slides. Obviously there's no town-owned land in here. There is wetlands. There are wetlands that would have to be excluded for, but it's a couple acres worth of wetlands in the middle of the district. So there's no public parks or anything like that. So it's a fairly clean site from that perspective and gaining compliance. So again, this is what the planning board is hoping to go forward with, and I think I can speak on behalf of the planning board, obviously open to ideas, open to change, were anything to come up. Did you ever?
This is embarrassing, but I just want to verify. This is part of the governor's landing,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So it already is slated, it's empty now, but it's slated for housing development.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
So this is not going to stay naked land, it's going to
No.
be developed. And what that does is that reduces the net growth, the net increase, because it's already going to be 27 units of housing, right?
Thank you, yeah. So what Kathy was just mentioning is that in the rectangle, the orange rectangle area, on that portion of the site, excluding the southernmost portion, because that excludes another parcel, and Governor's Landing wasn't really proposing on building on sort of that southern portion of that selected district, that will already support 27 units as proposed. And so obviously, the difference between 27 units versus 150, you're playing with the site, like I mentioned earlier. It's already gone through a rigorous a review process, been approved by both the zoning board and the planning board as being an appropriate site for development. So it's, kind of like similar but different in the sense that other communities have districts that they were able to submit to the state saying, hey, we're already compliant with the MBTA zoning requirements because we have a multifamily district that's within proximity to an MBTA train stop. Here you have a district or a proposed district that by way of how it's been approved is somewhat complies with the intent of the district. You'd obviously be increasing the density of what they'd be able to do there as a result. So thank you.
But if you have existing houses that are going to meet the requirement, you still have to slap a zone on it, right?
Yes.
You still have
Yes.
to add the zone to an existing, already compliant.
And
set of houses.
the person who has proposed this could then come back to us and say, remember those 27 houses I proposed? I'm actually gonna come back and I want 200. And I think,
Or 150.
well, there's capacity for more than that.
I know, but we don't have to
14,
allow it.
23 acres.
But we don't have to allow it.
No.
Yeah, so I mean, this is
we
what
do
the
have to
compliance
allow
model
15
spit out as far as the units
Yeah.
that are potential. But I'd be working with the planning board and CMRPC to make sure that we're not going an unreasonable number beyond what the minimum requirement is. I mean, it's my understanding, I think most of the town would be in agreement.
It's
Obviously, I
part-
mean, speak for most of the town, that we would, at least through this practice, zone for much and well over and above what the state minimum would be. So we're basically looking for compliance.
And sorry, I have another question that really is for you. You said that you cannot zone it to be age restricted, but we already have the ability to take an area of AR zone, and the builder can say, I want to build an age restricted unit on it, even though that's not to the zoning requirement. Is that also not allowed for the builder to do age restricted development within the MBTA zone? Can you prevent a builder from doing that?
You, through the zoning, I assume through the use table, you could prevent a developer from building an age-restricted development in an MBTA district. To flip that question around, similar to what Michael just said about allowing mixed use but not requiring it, you could allow for different types of senior housing in your MBTA district, and you could allow for the possibility of age restricted. You just can't mandate it. So you can't tell the developer the only way you can build here is if it's 55 plus, but you could give them the option to do that along with multifamily as of right, not age
But
restricted.
I thought you said, when you were saying the don'ts, you can't exclude families, you can't exclude, but a developer can. A developer can come in and say, I want to take this and put 55 over on here.
Right, so again, it's about what the zoning allows for. So as long as you, the town, provide the option of by right multifamily, non-age restricted, non-bedroom restricted,
That sucks.
you can also, but you don't have to, right? You could just say, we don't want age restricted housing.
Yeah.
So as I say, there's a lot of flexibility in it. It's really about what are your goals as a community and how do you want that reflected in where you put the district and how you set the zoning.
I know some of Governor's Landing is age restricted. How would that, if we did that?
They would be able to come back with a non-age restricted if they were.
I'll also clarify
For the, that would we still comply with our numbers? You know,
yeah, I believe so, but I'll just clarify. As it relates to Governor's Landing, their senior housing doesn't start until outside of this district
okay.
anyway. So that won't, it honestly won't affect, I mean, it will affect them if they decide to capitalize on this, which I imagine they would, but it won't impact the compliance of this. Yeah. Move to the breakout session.
Okay, so the last slide, we'll get into our breakout session. So as Mike said, what we would love is some additional ideas, if you have any, beyond the two that we just went through. So on each of your tables, you'll see a map of the town. There's roads, there's parcels of land, and then you'll see a lot of green in the case of Upton. All that green is what the state considers to be excluded land, like we talked about before. Anything that's not green is potentially developable and could be included in the district. So I've left a marker on each table, and we're hoping you could take maybe 20 minutes to work together and maybe outline some other potential districts.
I actually have one more question.
Sure.
And when you were talking earlier, we mentioned wetlands. You can't count wetlands. A lot of the land in Upton where we were looking at potential sites is ledge. And you don't really know what the ledge is until you do the geotechnical. So theoretically, can you include, like, let's say downtown West Upton, which the old Pleasant Woods is ledge. Can you include that?
Yep, ledge is not one of the excluded land factors because the state doesn't, I don't think the state has a map of where all the ledge rock is. But if you have local knowledge of where it is, that may be a
Never heard of
consideration.
it. Don't even know what ledge is. Marcia has.
Oh, sorry.
We have the 40B housing too, and that unit count, we have 150 in this unit count, and I'm not sure where the 150 comes from, but is there any overlap at all? Can any of the MBTA units help to satisfy the 40B units?
And 40B is that's a proposal that's already in place. I mean, we could potentially put the MBTA as an overlay over where the 40B is, if that's dense enough, but.
Well, I was under the impression that with the 40B, you could, as long as it is, if the, you look at the people renting and you adjust the rent appropriately and it's deeded, then it counts, even if it's like a two-family.
Right, but this wouldn't change the proposal that's already out there for the 40B development, if that's what you're asking.
Well, it would help toward the count, because I don't think we have a full count.
Well, help towards the count that allowed for a 40B to come in? Is
Do
that
you mean the
what-
town's
Yeah.
total 40B
Yeah.
deficit, affordable housing deficit?
Yes,
Yes,
thank you.
yes.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
yeah, but it's too late for the proposal we've already seen, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay.
By zoning this now, that's not going to help with the count that already went into place to allow the 40B proposal we're seeing.
Okay.
That's already
I
in
didn't
place.
realize all the units were accounted for. I thought we were still short.
Oh, we are still,
We are
it'll help
still,
towards
yeah.
future units potentially, but not.
And that's why I was
Yeah.
asking, could there be any overlap?
Yeah.
And I do believe the feasibility study you did said that Upton could afford, the inclusionary zoning, what we did to prevent increasing our deficit, says 1 in every 6. If you're building more than 6 units, you have to put 1 affordable. I think when you were doing the feasibility analysis, didn't you say we could actually get a little bit more affordable in, like, we go up to like,
Yeah, the economic feasibility analysis that RKG provided, I believe, gave us a number of up to 12.5% of a proposed minimum inclusionary zoning requirement for the MBTA district, should we decide to pursue that.
which would help with our deficit.
Yeah.
It wouldn't eliminate it, but it would help it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
because if you're only hitting 10%, you're sort of staying
Yeah.
even with your
Yeah.
40B.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Exactly.
you.
Okay, great. I'll be walking around. If you have any other technical questions, I'm happy to answer them, or questions on the map. But yeah, we're really just looking for your feedback on districts. When you go through, if you identify districts, if you wouldn't mind labeling them like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because on the worksheets on the table with the little pictures of housing types,
Just your.
we'd love to also know,
We're gonna redesign
mostly for
the-
zoning and unit capacity, within those districts, what kind of housing might you want to see there? So for those different types of housing, I labeled like districts A, B, C, D, E. If you just put a check mark there for the different types of housing you might want to see, that would be really helpful, I think, like going forward.
So we're gonna do the.
And just let us know if you have any questions. Thanks.
Yeah.
I can't wait for the town meeting, this will be interesting. Oh, 5 years, I'm with my partner.
Okay. Okay.
Mansion,
But I've got
I'm in wealth
11 acres.
management.
Yeah, which
Me and
would
my
make sense at a certain amount downtown. You're not getting my land, but
Oh, 5 years ago.
so it's until I die.
So it's,
Yeah.
they're not gonna go above, like these green areas, these are the places.
No, green is
That should be legal.
Okay.
green is green, you can't build on it.
So it's a white space.
Your town.
Doesn't,
Yeah,
I don't know what's up in that.
I think it's, can we draw these maps, Grace? This is where we're talking about the government,
Okay,
I believe.
yeah, I think you're right.
Because that's the road guy.
Okay,
And so this is all these parcels are gonna be over 55, so we're talking in here, which is now zone, which is now governor's land, legislated to put 20 foot, 100, you know, if they want, up to 100. No, 127. 127. Yeah.
to
So-
meet the 150
No,
requirement?
no.
Oh, it
No.
doesn't count.
No, this here is,
Separate.
this is
Okay.
over 55. So what we've been doing is, so there's gonna be something like
Okay.
over 55.
Town owned and
155
available
is
versus
gonna be.
restricted.
And Grace always corrects me when I'm wrong, so please correct me if I'm making things up.
I'm thinking, you know, it's on the way.
All right, everyone, I think everyone's, I think, reached logical conclusions. So,
But this is all,
we got people leaving.
this was all,
Thanks, Paul.
We voted. We voted, Mike.
this might.
Well, I'll speak for your group then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This group over here felt that the Governor's Landing was a good site to keep with. Lori, Kathy, what about this group? What'd you land on?
Governors.
We're still dicking around with it.
Still thinking?
We're actually, I've been pushing for this. What is this here?
What is what?
Way up in the northwestern corner,
I
On
just
North
under the
Street?
highway.
On the north
No.
street?
That land has frontage on either Fay Mountain or George Hill.
So that's way in the boonies.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Grafton Road,
yeah, so this comes to
George Hill.
George Hill goes back up through, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, there's horse farms up there. I used to take my kids riding up there. Yeah.
Yeah, one of these is owned by. And the gates
We would have to notify Grafton of the zoning change.
They would not be happy.
But the question is, that brings us, if way up there, chances of something getting built is slim to none. So do we want the housing, or do we want to make this a non?
Well, you don't necessarily know that because they might build there because then you can shoot into Grafton and
to
the
get the
Grafton train
train, which
station.
is the point of this.
Right.
That's what I was thinking, in Westboro Road, we've got that parcel in Westboro that we already own, it's on the way to
But
Westboro.
George Hill is
It has
really,
less impact traffic-wise in the whole thing.
but George Hill is really, I mean, I've walked there before, it's really treacherous up
Mhm.
there. to-
George Hill is currently gotta be the worst road in Grafton.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's
It
terrifying.
is,
It is.
it's
And I
horrendous.
have a feeling there's a lot of Native American stone stuff up there.
Conceivably.
Yeah.
So the recommendation from this group is Governor's Landing, but also want to evaluate that parcel that could potentially access off of
Well,
George
Lori
Hill.
also talked about the end of Westboro Road.
The land that we already own, or what this is here.
Oh, that's on
because it's
Grafton
the way
Road,
to
that's-
train.
Yeah, so
Train.
most of this, a lot of this land,
Is that right?
Do you want to just circle
Oh,
those
yeah,
properties?
Where is that?
25, I think.
So
25
do you want to
acres,
circle the
80.
properties so that we can get done,
Yeah.
that you want us to look at?
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, I live, yeah, this.
So what is the one that's 25 acres that's coming on?
It's on the corner of Williams
Basically
Street
about-
and 140.
It has frontage on West Main Street and Mechanic Street. It's in between.
Oh, the one behind all those houses?
Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
this little road goes back there and
Yeah.
there's three houses
This
there, I
person.
think. Yeah, that looks like it right there.
But
The-
apparently-
Is that-
And that's on the way out of town.
The
going to
only
these-
problem, again, my
places that have the
reluctance
train.
about that one would be, I doubt it would get through town meeting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That would be
So,
a-
so the other one
Because
that,
the people around here are not gonna want, there's too much development, houses around here.
Yeah.
They're not gonna want that type of development.
so the other one that we just
Yeah,
added, yeah.
It's
Very little development with that.
yeah.
No, you were talking the ones Mechanic Street and,
I would retire before it's done because I'd never be able to get to work.
yeah, that's. the
Okay,
thing.
are we done?
It'd be like a
Okay.
Route 9
So
sort of
I
thing.
have a motion to adjourn the planning board
Yeah, I
meeting.
gotta get out.
Okay, all right. Planning board is adjourned.